I have never played a single game of League of Legends in my life, and I count myself better off for it, okay? I consider myself blessed to have never found myself in the trenches of a League lobby. However, recently I have made the startling and horrific discovery that I am not too far off the core demographic of League players. This thought terrifies me, because over the weekend I saw the new cinematic, Welcome to Noxus, which was great, but then I saw this thing, and I said, would. Okay, so today, calm down. So today we are sculpting Trundle, or trigonometry, or whatever his name is. And I'm a little nervous to sculpt him because he has so much muscle that I've never had to sculpt before, and capturing all that detail can be a bit challenging. And it just so happens that you too could be considered challenged if you don't subscribe. I'm trying to get to 100,000 subs before you stop being hard stuck in gold. Or if you're Ludwig, you stop being hard stuck in plat. All right, let's get started, and the first thing we're gonna do is make an armature. Usually I would use wire from the craft store, but I find that it's either too flimsy for me or I am too aggressive for it. So I marched my way to Home Depot, where the clientele looked almost exactly like Trumpet, and I got some stronger wire for this project since I knew he would be pretty heavy. I still wound the wire around itself for extra sturdiness, but honestly it made opening Kitten's legs pretty difficult. Once I got his skeleton into position on my sculpting block, I could start bulking it out with some aluminum foil. Now, if you didn't know, foil does two things in sculpting. It saves me from using more clay than I need to, and it also helps the clay bake more evenly. For this sculpture in particular, I went a little lighter than I'm used to on the foil, mostly because I didn't know how much clay I would end up having to scrape away to detail his muscles, and we don't really want to see the foil poking out of his skin, so it was a delicate balance. Once we had foil covering up all the wire, I could start covering him in a layer of clay. We'll be adding details in a more progressive way, so this part is really only to cover up all the foil. I can't stop laughing at this part. Once it's covered up, I'm gonna give him some quick cheeks and then start working on his legs. Oh my god. For me, it's always easier to work from the bottom up, so first I'm gonna refine his legs a bit, cutting away any extra clay and shaping them with my fingers. Now comes the part that I was actually nervous about, and that's just figuring out how to add muscle. I had like 4 graphs up in front of me of the human thigh, and if anything is not entirely accurate, it's because Trojan is a frost troll and not a human. So get dunked on. Now, I was a bit messy at first, but I found that drawing on where the individual muscle would go first and then carving into those lines that I drew worked out pretty well. From there, I took my time smoothing it out a bit and adjusting all the sections of muscle until I could look at them without wanting to die. Okay, look at that. You could say that we've gotten a leg up on this project. With the left leg done, I can repeat the same process on the other leg, but this time with about 6% more confidence. Now once his legs are as shredded as a bowl of wheat, we're gonna start on his upper body. And much like the legs, I'm gonna start on just one half so I can get some good practice in. The first thing we're gonna be doing is adding some more bulk to his arms. They were looking a bit skinny for his frame. And once they have a little more volume to them, I work a little bit on his armpit and pec area to help make sure that his arm is gonna end up the right size in comparison. You see, I don't wanna detail his entire arm and then start working on his pecs, only to realize that his bahongas have way more mass than I expected them to need, and then have to bulk out his arm again. So yeah, weirdly enough, maybe it's because I only ever bother to do leg day, but I just had a much easier time sculpting his legs than I did his arms. Something just took way longer to click in my head for this part, but once I got the bicep to forearm connection looking right, things started sailing a bit smoother for me. Now before I could really complete the backside tricep area of his arm, I figured that I should map out his back muscles to make sure everything is proportional, just like I did on the other side. Also keep in mind that a lot of this muscle will be covered up, so I know he looks way too shredded now, but once we smooth him out and put some clothes on, it'll all make sense. With the back muscles on, I started working on his torso, and his abs were pretty simple. The oblique area was a little hard, but other than that, this part was a breeze. With the right half of his upper body done, I mirrored that onto the other half, and boom, he's got the beginnings of a body yaddy yaddy. Now before I smooth him out, we're gonna give him some dogs, and they call them that because they make me go woof, so I had 3 toes on each side along with some ankles and a heel. Now my sculpture stand is a little bit busted because I made it myself, so I'm putting this tape here to give me a flatter surface to work on. Once I repeat the process for this other foot, we're gonna switch focus to his next set of digits. Off camera, I bent up some wire for his hands and adjusted it to sculpt his fingers on top of. Triangle has a big old ice club that he'll be holding, so I made this placeholder with a toothpick and some tape to sculpt on for the time being, and then I took my time adding clay to each segment of wire until they kind of started to look like fingers. Once he had 3 whole fingers on each side, round of applause to him. It's time for the next part, and that entails momentarily turning him into wide neck, minus the recent controversy. But once he had a neck, we are going to try for the Trapezoid face sculpt speed run. So start the clock. And done. Time. Hit time. What was my time? Yeah, don't even bother looking for this category. There's no way you could beat me. Anyway, before I start actually sculpting his face, I'm gonna make a bunch of the smaller parts of this sculpture that we need to pre-bake. So starting out, I make a bunch of nails for his hands and feet, as well as some tusks, some teeth, some eyeballs, and a few antlers that will eventually go on one of his arms. And we'll start by adding nails to his hands and feet. So once all of his nails were on, I couldn't wait any longer, and I wanted to smooth him out so he was a bit more pleasant to look at while we sculpted his face. So with a paintbrush and some acetone, I brush over his entire figure to smooth out any gashes and make the muscles look a lot cleaner. Now with his body all smoothed out, it's finally time for the face, and his is pretty intricate. Or at least it felt like that, because the closest thing to a human face that I've sculpted in a while is this. Now for me, I knew everything had to start with the nose, because he has a nose big enough to honk. I mean, seriously, if I pressed it hard enough, you would probably hear a car horn. But once I had a general size to go off of, I could then start building out the major features of his face, like his brow ridge, mouth, and chin. As I added more features, I could go back and refine the other ones to match his face and be more accurate to my reference material. That way he actually starts looking like Trapdoor and not like Human Shrek. But at a certain point, I couldn't really add any more details until I got some eyeballs in there, so I pressed in 2 of our pre-baked ones and continued detailing his features. Okay, so big problem. He's bald. We already made a Ludwig joke in this video. I don't want to overdo it. But the first thing I need to do before we start actually adding hair is mapping out the border between his hair and face. I'm using some clay noodles and adjusting them until I feel like he's got enough of his face poking out. Not too much, because he's got a lot of hair. And once I have this border established, I'm adding some big chunks of clay to pretty much every side of his head. It's gonna look like a helmet for a little bit, okay? You ever hear artists complaining about drawing hands? Yeah, if that makes 2D artists want to kick a wall with open-toed shoes, then sculpting hair makes a 3D artist want to swim in an active volcano. And before we get too high up with all of these hair chunks, I'm gonna add in some ears that I pre-baked so I can continue detailing the rest of his head. Now after doing that detailing, I cleaned up the top part of his hair with some acetone to make sure that I liked the direction it was all going in. And once I was satisfied with the progress so far, I did the same thing to his beard. We're not gonna 100% detail all of his hair yet because he has a big boar pelt that we'll be adding soon, and I want to finish his hair after that step. But next came the very tedious process of making his hairline look natural, and after 400 years of adjusting it, I gave his hair one last temporary smooth before starting to work on all his clothes. The first thing we're gonna give him is a crossbody belt with a very simple strip of clay. We'll add details later, don't worry. And then we're gonna start working on the pelts of leather around his waist. I rolled out a big flap of clay and used my xacto knife to cut out a rough edge, and then in several layers I placed them on his body and cut them to size. Once I felt like they were the right shape, I roughed up the outer edges to match the top edges. I also almost forgot to give him underwear, so I cut the back leather pelt in half to give me a temporary opening and then sealed that back up when the job was done. Then I discovered something. So I think I subconsciously made the slit of his, what is this called? Editing Diana, insert what it's called with like a robo voice.
Loincloth.
Loincloth. I think I made the slit of his loincloth a little bit too high. He's showing a little bit too much thigh. And as a result, his belt doesn't really fit right. Like there should be a little more leather underneath it. So I'm going to fix that and then we'll add the belt. Fixed. I also figured that while I was at it, I would increase the length of his pelt in the back. As much as I'd love to see him in a micro skirt, that would be inaccurate to the source material, so I will leave that to the artists on Twitter. Off camera, I finished up the pre-baked accessories, so his arm antlers, the helmet on his belt, next to it would be the skull. On the back side of his belt, he has this metal thing, oops, and most importantly, his grundle shield. The only thing left to do for these accessories is sanding them down a bit. Once they were sanded, I started with the shield and a scrap piece of wire to press it in place. Once that was in, I could attach all the other accessories. Now, before I attached the metal thing on the back of his belt, I had to add a bit of height to it, so I did that and then continued on with that thing. I was getting a little thirsty at this point and all others, so I decided to crack open, or try to open a monster. Sponsor me, please. League of Legends, help me out here. Give me a monster sponsorship. I'm not kidding about that. Please help me. Okay, it's 4:30 now, so we need to cover those dainty and demure shoulders with a fur pelt. First thing I'm gonna do is just put the beginning slab down and then add additional pieces of clay to drape down his back. Also, doesn't this look like... Or is that just me? For the boar face, I started with the nose and slowly built out his cheeks from there. Once the shape was looking right, I could start the eternal process of texturing each individual hair on this stupid boar. Also, I cut my hand on a mandolin, so for the next few clips, you'll be seeing these annoying bandages. I wasn't sure exactly how I was gonna do this because I wanted the boar fur to look a bit different from Tropical's hair. So after I smoothed out that first round of texturing I did with some acetone, I started adding some more tufts of fur to play around with until I found a texturing technique that I liked. Now, I like how the boar hair is looking. I almost don't even want to smooth it out because I feel like it would have a rougher texture, but I think I'm still gonna. Is Trundle the type to get his furs dry cleaned? Oh, also look, I got a better bandage so it's not in your face, so... You're welcome for injuring myself. Now, after I made the decision to smooth out the boar pelt, I felt like it was pretty much done, so I moved on to his arm and leg covers. First thing we need to do is just get the base of all of these on, so for that I used thin flat sheets of clay and wrapped them around his arms and legs. For the covers on his legs, or leg warmers, whatever they are, I added some wrinkles and folds and smoothed it out with acetone. Now after sculpting both on, they felt a little plain to me, so I tried wetting the clay with some more acetone, giving it a little time to dry, but while it was still soft, stippling my brush over it to give these pieces some texture. Now I ended up liking this a lot, so once that was done, I added some leather straps and became increasingly dissatisfied with the shape of his toenails. Insane segue, I know, but after looking at a few more of the screenshots from Welcome to Noxus, I realized that he had pointy toenails. Like girlfriend under the covers pointy toenails, so I'm just gonna add some more clay on top of the toenails that we already put on. And with his feet in prime condition, I moved on to adding similar details to his armbands. Now, although both armbands have straps, only one of them has these two giganto antlers on them, so I pre-wrapped a few straps on them and then added more straps on top of that to really set myself up to become frustrated when I have to paint this. Alright, back to his face. We're finally nearing the end of sculpting, and obviously Trampoline has some big old tusks, so I'm gonna add those. Then I'm gonna add some more details to his face just because he needs to look as stressed and angry as I was making him. With one of the coldest mugs I've ever sculpted, double entendre alert, I finally went back to his hair to add some more majestic swoops and some teeny tiny strands. Then I textured his loincloth and went back to all of his belt bits to carve some detail into them. And finally, this is always one of my favorite parts of sculpting, we're gonna go over him in some isopropyl alcohol to remove all the lint and light debris. Just kidding, I didn't get that far before realizing that I wanted to add a few more details before we bake him, starting with a few arm veins. He needs a pair of nips, and as a wise man once said, Blastoise not now, as well as some wrinkles in key areas like his knuckles and toe knuckles. And after spending some time in an oven, probably not the best place for a frost troll, but sacrifices must be made, the clay is all cured and he is officially ready to paint. I also got this new color. How did he say it? I love that Vine, or that kid. Vine. It was a Vine, right? Rest in peace, Vine. I will never forget you. Speaking of, you should actually follow me on TikTok at Crossing Crafts. This is my only TikTok account, and I'm gonna start posting there more often, or at least try to. You know, I might not be able to post bangers like road work ahead, or butt cheek on a stick. So now we're gonna give his skin a coat of blue. So for now, we're gonna hold off on detailing his skin. I ain't the cleanest painter there is. So we'll do the rest of it last, that way I don't ruin any details if my hand decides to pretend that it's a fault line. For now, our focus will be on painting the brown bits. So to start, I'm just gonna go over everything that will be brown and give it a rudimentary coat of paint. And once I have all the brown blocked in, we can start detailing each part. The first one I wanted to try my hand at was his loincloth. I'm basically gonna blend lighter and lighter shades of this brown at the edges of it, and I only ever use super cheap acrylic paint. I'm talking like 50 cents a bottle cheap. So to get a pretty smooth blend, I just worked as quickly as I could, screaming the entire time, and kept everything from drying out. Once all the edges of his loincloth were sufficiently weathered, I took the middle shade of the lighter browns that I mixed up and applied that to the edges of his arm and leg bands. Now next up is his belt, and since it looks like a different material, I want it to look a bit different than everything else, even if it's also brown. So to do that, I decided to try and mimic a slightly painterly color effect. It took a little bit of messing around to get it to stand out the right amount, but I think it turned out pretty cool, and it did its job, so I'm happy with it. Next was taking a lighter brown and going over the edges of the belt with very thin lines that I'm not gonna blend out. One of the goals I had with painting Tractor is trying my very best to mimic the beautiful art style that Fortiche, the animation studio behind Welcome to Noxus, also Arcane, has developed. So just going forward, we'll be using a lot of cartoony, painterly, unblended techniques in tandem with each other to achieve that, so keep that in mind. Also, these spots annoy me so much, but we have to wait to fix them. Alright, so all of his straps I'm gonna paint a much darker brown and detail the edges of all of them so they stick out a bit more and look appropriately weathered. Also, do you remember when I foretold the prophecy of myself getting annoyed at painting this armband because of how many straps it had? Yeah, let's just say if YouTube doesn't work out for me, I'll be pitching my fortune teller tent because oh my god, that part was so annoying to paint. But while I had this color out, I painted over all the bones, including the ones on his belt, and fixed any of the many mistakes I made with another layer of brown paint. Once I had the base color down for the skull, I gave it some extra details with black paint, and then moved on to painting the helmet. Now for Trenton, New Jersey's shield, I couldn't mix up a color that looked metallic enough with the cheap acrylic that I used, so instead I gave it a light base coat to cover up any brown paint that I smudged on there, and then I buffed on some liquid leaf, which is a lot more metallic looking than my paint. And once that was done, I made his arm straps match his leg straps. Ah, the thing. Still no clue what this thing is, all I know is that it's probably made of metal, so I painted it with some metallic paint, sped up the drying process with a hairdryer because God forbid I'm alone with my thoughts for more than 15 seconds, and then I painted the thread on the inside of it. Next up on the detailing agenda is the boar pelt, so I take my time adding lots of light strands to its hair as well as blending the edges into a white color. Oh boy. Now next up is his hair, and I definitely took my time on this part. The only goal I have for this part is making sure that it doesn't look like I put him in an Amazon basic sexy Ronald McDonald wig, so the first thing we're gonna do is give his hair a base color. And once he had a strong coat of red on, I tested out a wash on a small area, and I really liked how it turned out. So next, I'm gonna apply a dark reddish-brown wash to sink into all the lines of his hair and add more depth. After that dried, I went around his hairline and started cleaning it up, but honestly, this was the part that I was most nervous about. I didn't want the transition from his skin to his hair to be so harsh, just because it looked so ugly. So after tinkering around a bit, I found that very lightly dry brushing his hairline with his skin tone made it look so much better. Once I was satisfied with his hairline, I went around his entire head, and I used a few different shades of red and dark pink to accentuate individual strands of hair. Now after working on his hair for a while and being really happy with how it turned out, I realized that his boar pelt needed a little something something, so I gave it a dark brown wash to add a little more oomph to it. And with the boar pelt done, I finally could paint his crossbody belt and give it those strong cartoony detail lines. And that pretty much concludes the paint job on everything that Tripod wasn't born with, so now we can go back over his whole body and finally paint over any mistakes that I smudged on his skin. Alright, so his skin is a blank slate once more, so now it's time to give his skin some texture, and this was a lot more simple than I originally imagined it would be. I mixed up a few darker shades of his skin tone, and starting with the lightest one, I painted on a bunch of random brush strokes. Once that dried, I went one shade darker and did the same thing, overlapping that last layer. Now, since this was my first attempt at getting this skin texture right, I decided to limit my first try to his bicep until I was absolutely positive that I liked this method. But after getting about 4 to 5 layers done on his bicep, I really liked the direction things were going and continued this method all around his body. I also tried to concentrate the darker colors of his skin where you would automatically expect them to be, so his knuckles, knees, elbows, you get the point. I painted his nails and started giving him very well-defined, super dark blue wrinkle definition, and for that part I used my X-Acto knife. I felt like even my smallest brushes were too thick. Now, after I got most of his skin done on the first half of his body, I added the 2 scars on his chest, both with my X-Acto knife. Alright, now, not to brag, but come on, he's really coming together now, look at him. And now that I kind of got the hang of it, I just did the same thing to the other side of his body. After a while, I also started adding some dark and light blue scratches or scars to his body with my X-Acto knife. Honestly, this X-Acto knife method that I have been using the whole time, by the way, is horrible. Don't use it. The paint on it dried so fast that like every 3 out of 5 times that I lifted it from the palette to triathlon, it would already be dry. And then it just looked like I was rubbing an X-Acto knife on him. So lesson learned. Anyway, now it's time for the most important part of the sculpture, his face. Now we need to yassify Trinidad, okay? He needs to have a face card that is insane. He needs to look so good that someone watching this makes a fonk edit of him looking incredible. So we are gonna texture his face pretty much the exact same way, just a lot more carefully. After I'm done adding some heavy shading to his face, he's already looking a lot more fierce, ready to serve. So now I'm gonna add all of his freckles, mostly on his forehead, and give his mouth and the underside of his nose a very light pink wash. Once that's dry, I'm gonna give his face a few wrinkles and cuts, as well as some lines on his mouth. And finally, we are going to paint his eyes, starting with his scleras. Now, at first I painted his eyes a light gray, but I ended up painting one shade darker over that just because they looked too light, so here's that before and after. And then I used a tiny ball stylus and a needle tip tool to detail his iris and pupils. Once his eyes were done, I painted his boar tusks, and then cut out his forehead crown with some sheets of super thin pre-baked clay. Once I cut them out, I painted them with the same color that I used for his shield, and glued them on his forehead. Alright boys, we're almost done. The last thing we need to do is make a super simple quick base and his ice club. Starting with his base, I'm taking a rectangle of XPS foam that I had lying around and cutting the edges so they look like rocks. Once I figured out a shape I liked, I pressed a ball of foil into the whole thing to give it more texture, and then I glued down some gravel from my backyard. And after sealing up all those loose rocks with some more glue, I paint the base to make it look more like the cool gray rocks that Treadmill is surrounded by in the Welcome to Noxus cinematic. And after a few layers of dry brushing, I gave the whole thing a dark wash to really make the rocks pop. And once that wash dried, I painted all of the areas that I wanted to cover in static grass. I poured out my static grass mix and applied some Mod Podge mixed with that paint we used earlier, and then applied our static grass. Once all those yellow areas had grass, I shook off any extra to go back in the jar, then applied some hot glue to secure trachea to the foam. And the last step was carving and painting out an ice club from a hunk of blue clay that I pre-baked. Carving it was very satisfying. Once I liked the shape of it, I could start painting on the final details. Once the ice club was done, I glued that in place, only to realize that this video is now nearing the standard time of a league match. So in the interest of my retention statistics, let's jump into the final shots. And as always, I have to give a big shout out to all my lovely patrons, including my new DIYers Hanushka, Jargon, and Buff Avocado, my new crafters AJ Mart and Audrey K. And you know what? I will even shout out a free member this time. Shout out to Juice Rat Bastard, Rat Emoji, Red Solo Cup Emoji, and Raining Emoji. Instead of spending that $500 to clothe one of your twink champions, you could spend as little as $3 to get access to my Patreon, where I post updates as I craft, highlight photos, editing timelines, and I give you a fun shout out at the end of the next video, so yeah, check that out. In the meantime, let me know if there's anything else from the Welcome to Noxus cinematic you'd like to see me craft, or anything else League of Legends adjacent, really. Make sure to follow me on TikTok and Twitter at Crossing Crafts, because I'll most likely devolve into a Trundle fan cam account. So until then, I will see you guys next time.